Carlin's 2 volumes of mathematical programming and game theory, and it was about duels and bomber battleship problems and so on. And I just did not feel comfortable with any of these things. I always really wanted it to be a very intuitive, satisfying sense of decision theory, understanding that it's somewhat more complicated to approach it in a multi-person context, but it ought to be that a game tree just factors apart into decision trees for each player, that we should think of the game tree as just a way of patching together people's individual perceptions of a situation. They have their decision trees. The actions of one player become events in the decision tree of another player. That should all be sort of obvious, I thought. But in fact, it turns out that game theory had an elaborate set of devices, technical devices, by which they approached these various aspects. So, for example, Harsanyi's version, of the type space and so on like that, I thought, well, all of this was to derive Bayes' rule, which I thought, well, I was assuming that all along. But I'm glad that that you showed us how to do this. But why was this necessary? And I realize, Roger's here. He's the father of proper equilibrium, but perfect equilibrium and proper equilibrium, all these epsilons floating around. Why do we have to perturb the game to get an answer? I saw these as kind of a convenient technical tools which are good for sort of an exploratory analysis to get, let's say, an initial understanding or initial results so that we get a hold of what's going on. But I felt very uncomfortable with the idea of that this is what the subject is. The subject is the study of, I don't know, let's say if I say perfect equilibrium, then it says, well, we properly study the game by shrinking the simplex of mixed strategies, and then we expand it. And then we see what limits we get. It's like this. Now, on the other hand, I had enormous respect, say, for Selton's insights about subgame perfection, about perfection as a solution concept. I had always a preference for the extensive form analysis, but I'm quite agreeable to the idea that the normal form analysis should be sufficient. It's just that you're not given many clues about how to do it in the normal form. You have to be pretty clever to understand how to apply to the normal form the kinds of ideas that become quite natural in the extensive form. So subgame perfection can be explained as iterative elimination of weakly dominated strategies in the normal form. But in the extensive form, it sort of jumps out at you as backward induction, and so they appear in 2 different guises in these 2 representations of the same problem. So what my aim today to do, excuse me.
I think it's perfectly fair to say that the guy who wrote proper equilibrium paper was trying to understand sequential equilibrium, didn't understand sequential equilibrium, trying to figure out how to find it in the normal form because he thought that that's what you had to do. And now we understand sequential equilibrium, so it's much clearer.
Well, I'm here today to argue that that sequential equilibrium, which you said you said in your talk that in 1982 it sort of completed the answer to the questions that Luce and Rafa raised in 1957. Well, my sense was that was a mild disaster. The sequential equilibrium turned out to have enormous flaws. And the revelation of those flaws has I think, been actually opening up what the real challenge is for game theory in terms of establishing what its foundations are. Now, I realize there are all these applications, there are these rich domain of applications and so on, but it's been unsettling to me the game theory went off down this track of technical devices, more and more elaborate technical devices, without establishing foundations. And the foundations have remained opaque. They're clear up to a certain point. I think I would take the point of view up to the point of sequential equilibrium. And then we're going to, I want to suggest that there's a lot more to do. But I'm just repeating the agenda of Kohlberg-Mertens, who, I mean, my view is that the Bible for what the future of at least the foundational work in game theory ought to be was laid down by Kohlberg-Mertens 30 years after Luce and Rafa. They said the next step is to have an axiomatic construction that establishes the solution concepts of game theory in terms of these elementary decision theoretic principles, and let's get to it. Not a lot has happened in the intervening 20 years, but I'm going to talk about some aspects of that. So I will certainly subscribe to the view that we can take basic decision theory, say Jimmy Savage, as our foundation, and the key idea being that strategies, optimal strategies, are justified by what your beliefs are about the things you don't know, and in these situations, what you don't know is some things nature might have done, but also what other people have done or will do. I'm going to skip this thing about is equilibrium relevant because it has a bunch of things in it about whether randomized strategies involve objective probabilities, which is from the Savage framework is a little mysterious. We can appeal to Harsanyi's view that all we're trying to do is make our own decisions sort of unpredictable to the other party. Little perturbations and payoffs maybe could explain that. But usually we have private information available. Either the game can be purified or itself, like poker can be purified in the sense that for every mixed equilibrium there's a pure strategy equilibrium that's equivalent. But usually we have all kinds of private information, what we ate for breakfast, what we read in the paper, what our wife said this morning, da-da-da, you know. There's all this information that is very finely, much more finely detailed than even is needed. So I'm going to take the point of view that we have a game tree. If it has perfect recall, then it creates a decision tree for each player. And as a foundational thing, we should really think that it's these collection of decision trees that we're looking at. And they tie down who moves, when, what do they know when they move, what can they do. All of these details are laid out in the tree. I do mention here as an alternative that for a lot of these applications, you're really depending on some sort of Markovian representation where there's a sufficient statistic of the history so we don't have all this hugely history-dependent kind of strategies. As I said, I thought I was going to be sitting around the table talking in a seminar style. So the Kohlberg-Mertens program. They set forth as to say, what exactly would we mean by rational behavior in a multi-person setting? And at the time, they approached it from the point of view just of talking about it in the game. I think this was formalized later, really, although in some ways before and sometimes later, but the common knowledge of rationality. And in Israel, the Israeli school of game theory has very successfully pursued the program that common knowledge of rationality will imply almost everything that we think of as being Nash equilibrium. Although, in fact, that isn't what you get. You know, in Oman's formulation, you actually get a correlated equilibrium. You don't get a Nash equilibrium. For me, the part that I will talk about today is what's called strong belief in rationality, which was formalized a few years ago by Battagalli and Sinisculci. And it's one in which we actually address the matter of beliefs. which is that not only, like, do I believe I'm rational, I believe you're rational, I believe that you think that I'm rational, things like that, but that informing my beliefs on the basis of which I will choose my optimal actions, I will maintain the hypothesis that you are rational if there's any rational explanation for what I've seen so far. Right? If what I know is consistent with some rational behavior on your part, then my beliefs should be confined only to that.
Even off the equilibrium path.
Even off the equilibrium path, as long as I've still been rational, I should, if there's a rational explanation for your behavior, then I should put my belief there. Now, most people say, well, I thought that's what an equilibrium was. And that was supposed to be? No. This is this great failing of Nash equilibrium that I should just jump past all this. In fact, I should go to one of these examples. I'll go to beer quiche if I jump along here. Okay, here's beer quiche. Very famous game by Krebs, or Cho and Krebs. So we have, here's nature. He chooses that the first player is either the weak type or the strong type with these probabilities. Then the strong type can choose beer or quiche, and the weak type can choose beer or quiche. You understand the story. They're supposed to be at this roadhouse. There's this Hell's Angel who would like to pound the stuffing out of the quiche-loving type, if that's what he is. But if he's the strong type will smash the Hell's Angel, and the Hell's Angel will wish he hadn't challenged him. Okay, that's supposed to be the story, right? Okay, so so what we have is that either the weak or strong type could have chosen quiche. By the way, this is always described as quiche for breakfast or beer for breakfast. So here's the Hell's Angel, and all he's seen is quiche. And you might think he'll challenge him. But now, since both types, if both types choose quiche, then in fact, the greater probability is that he's the strong type, so he won't challenge, and you'll get that the response is to retreat rather than to fight. So we have an equilibrium, in fact, when both types choose quiche. What happens in the event of beer? Well, in that case, the Hell's Angel is prepared to fight. If he sees beer, he'll fight. Well, all of us, when we see this equilibrium, this is a Nash equilibrium, perfectly plausible. How's it come about? Well, his belief at this point is that it was more likely that the weak type deviated than the strong type. Why not? I mean, we haven't put any restrictions on beliefs. So as long as player 2 chooses fight with probability more than a half, both types choose quiche. And this example has been around now for 20 years. I think it's always pretty much convincing to people that this is a bad equilibrium. It's a sequential equilibrium. It's I don't know, perfect. It's not proper, by the way. It has lots of good things and bad things. But there's this other equilibrium, in which they both types choose beer. Okay, so there's two equilibria here, two equilibrium outcomes. Now notice we're talking about Nash equilibria. If this is a sequential equilibrium that I described, where they both come here, it's actually a whole big set of Nash equilibria, because there's all these randomizations over here. Any probability greater than a half of choosing fight is an equilibrium. Okay. So if I were to draw the graph, I don't know, I like to draw pictures of this. Space of games is very high dimensional and strategies. But the Nash equilibrium graph for those of you who don't know, this is called the structure theorem of Kohlberg-Mertens, which I consider a truly wonderful theorem, one of the most beautiful theorems in in game theory. So we'd say that the correspondence, say, looks like this. I don't know. Okay, so here's the game we're looking at here. There are two components of equilibria. Up here is the quiche one, and here's the beer one. And the nature of it, from the Kohlberg-Mertens point of view, is to say, well, the quiche one is a bad equilibrium because if we perturb the game a little bit, there's no equilibrium out here. This equilibrium, the quiche equilibrium, will disappear for the proper perturbation. That's all very interesting, but that's, again, those epsilons. It's those perturbations that are used to tell the story. The beer one is what's called stable, because you get a nearby equilibrium no matter how you perturb the game. In fact, this is what is called an essential component. As Don knows, he was my referee with our paper on essential equilibria. So from a mathematician's point of view, this is an essential fixed point of the fixed point map by which you identify equilibria. Now, beginning with Kohlberg-Mertens' paper, there became this agenda to try and establish what are the basic properties of good sets of equilibria. And to give you a start on this, let me mention maybe simple ones. Well, for example, I mean, you shouldn't be selecting things that use dominated strategies, or let's say weakly dominated, maybe. That would at least get you as far as subgame perfection, but in general, you'd like it to have a backward induction equilibrium, like a sequential equilibrium. There are a bunch of axiomatic properties that I think most people would say they're sort of obvious. I mean, they're sort of like Lloyd-Shapley's axioms for the value. It would be that the solutions of two independent games, put the games together, you get a solution that factors into the solutions of the two games. Or you can take a player and split them into two players at different information sets. That's like the agent normal form of a game. We should get the same kind of solution. It should have what's Mertens calls an ordinal property. It should only depend upon the ordinal properties of preferences. The one that I'm going to emphasize today is invariance, which says there are many different ways to write down this extensive form. I should be able to get the same solution no matter how I write down the extensive form. And in particular, it should be that if I add in a redundant strategy, that is one that's just a probability, if I just flip a coin to choose strategy A or B, that shouldn't make any difference, and so on. So you can have this list. Well, in this game, invariance itself will do it. So I think in this next slide I have that. So here we've taken exactly the same game and we just add in a little redundant strategy. We allow the strong type to randomize between whether he's going to choose quiche or beer. And you say, how could that possibly matter? Well, as soon as you do that, turns out that this equilibrium, the quiche equilibrium, just it's gone. So what happened is that this analysis that's been emphasized in game theory since Elise Selton's papers, which is 30-some years now, depending on perturbations. Well, this is an example in which we get the effect of a perturbation by applying invariance. All right? But invariance is a decision theoretic property. It says there's no presentation effect. You know, if Amos Tversky were here, he would say it's an illusion to think that this game with the redundant strategy is somehow different than the original game. You know, as I go back and forth here between the original and this one and this one and this one, it's like, these should be the same thing. I mean, these are just, you could always take a game and throw in some redundant strategies. People shouldn't be fooled by that. Okay? But it turns out that this has enormously powerful properties. So I'm going to go back now. Actually, as long as I'm working with pictures, here's another one. So, huh? I'm sorry, Roger? Huh?
Did you say why that extra pure strategy made a difference and that sequential equilibrium analysis?
I didn't show you. I'll send you a paper that has it in it. I have it with me. I can give it to you. But I didn't. I just say if you go through the full thing, okay. I'll now write down the. Okay. Let's see.
Change the Nash equilibrium?
I didn't show. The thing is, I didn't.
The normal form?
Okay. No. Okay. You now create the normal form, and you will see that the strategy in which the weak type chooses beer and the strong type chooses quiche is now dominated by this mixture.
It was already dominated by a weakly randomized strategy.
What you claim, it's because you're not allowing weakly dominated strategies to be part of the solution. That's what's actually happening. Because I see this as Roger.
Yeah, sure. That's a kind of a. But I'm pointing out that the invariance axiom, by sticking in the redundant strategies, it makes into something that was weakly dominated, it makes it dominated.
How can it be?
No. It's purely dominated,
Yeah.
randomly dominated.
Well, so let's be, I should say, conditionally dominated. Okay, so I have left out a step here. Okay. In the absence of QQ, so we're off in this other part of the game where QQ has been rejected. Now it's strictly dominated. Okay, I'm sorry, you're right. Okay. Now, let's say here's another game, and this is of a similar type, only this is considered sometimes the sort of most elementary example. So up here, so this said two versions of the game, so ignore this one for a minute. So right now we have that there's a player, one, who has an outside option of getting two, or he can play this game with the other player. And there are basically two equilibria, which we could also identify in the normal form, strategic form is said here. You can have that player two could use the right column here and use this column. That means that player one can only get payoff 0 or 1, in which case he would prefer 2, so he's deterred from moving into the subgame. But the alternative is to say, well, obviously, player 1 should be able to just move into the subgame. Player 2 should say, well, geez, you know, what's on his mind here? What's on his mind here is that this strategy for player 1, let's see, what have I got here? Well, anyway, let's think of it this way. He just comes in, he can get 3, okay? And that 2 is an equilibrium. That's another equilibrium of this same game. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so now, here again, you can add a redundant strategy. Notice this is just a mixture, 3/4 probability of the outside option, and 1/4 probability of choosing that top row. Okay. Now in this subgame here, there's a unique equilibrium. It's the 3-1 outcome, and therefore player 1 prefers to enter this subgame and chooses the 3-1. In fact, and he doesn't even choose the redundant strategy even. Now, this just gives you another example for a different kind of game of the role of these kinds of invariance properties. Okay. Let's see.
There's common knowledge. I mean, when you write the new,
Yeah.
you write the new
Well,
part, it's not just in the mind
okay.
of player one, it's also in the mind of player two.
Right. So I put in a little information set that's hard to see, but there's more than that. The variance principle would say that player 2 should understand from the absolute very beginning that invariance is that the game, however he described the game, he must be thinking about it in terms of all of its elaborations with redundant strategies. All the possible presentation effects you want to think of, it must be, we allow all of those, and the solution we get must be invariant to those. Okay. I did that here. Let me describe this next one, just to give you one more example. So here's this centipede game up here. Let's see, which one are we talking about? Okay, so this is a centipede game. If you were backward induction, you go, you know, the column player prefers down, then the row player prefers down, the column player prefers down, the first row player prefers down. They wind up that the row player initially just chooses down right off. But in fact, if you look at the Nash equilibria, there are a much larger set of Nash equilibria, and they include all these behaviors where player 1 or the row player, what would have player 2 done if player 1 had not chosen down, okay? And the stable set of equilibria, the one that looks like this in the graph, has as its two extreme points the subgame perfect equilibrium, and then one in which, in fact, it goes all the way out to here, you know, far out into the game. Well, here I've drawn in a redundant strategy. It may be a little unclear for some of you at a distance, but I put down exactly that tree, put it down here, and said that the row player can choose this redundant strategy, which is a combination delta and 1 minus delta of the delta was the cross kind of strategy, 1 minus delta was the outside option, okay? And again, it turns out now there's this unique sequential equilibria of this, and as you vary delta, you generate all of the equilibria in the stable set. This whole set of equilibria here, up and down, are all generated exactly by varying delta. Now, let me give you actually one more example, as long as I'm on a run here. Rennie's example. This is a very famous example. It is purported that the Kohlberg-Mertens program could never succeed because backward induction conflicts with what's called forward induction, which I've yet to introduce to you. But this is actually my main message, is forward induction. But when I looked at beer quiche, the way I was selecting is the equilibrium of the choosing beer. That's sometimes called forward induction. I'm going to explain that in a minute, but right now I want to just look at this. Forward induction could be interpreted as saying, I should assume that a player is attempting to be, that his behavior is rational for some expectation, for some belief he has. So in this example, if we work backwards with backward induction, player 2 should go down, therefore player 1 should go down, player 2 should go down, so player 1 should go down again. But suppose player 1 does not. What should player 2 do? And in this one, you might say, well, player 1's strategy of down at this stage is dominated by going down at the first stage. So you might argue that the only plausible possibility then is that he's planning to go across all the way and try and get the 3. That's the only possible rational explanation for going across. Now, so let's put in that strategy. So I've written down here, again, adding a redundant strategy. There's a probability 1 minus delta of the outside option, and then delta probability of just going right across. Always going across, hoping to get the 3. What happens? Well, now in the subgame, there's again a unique equilibrium of this subgame. I stuck in the redundant strategy, and now the equilibrium is unique. And in particular, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't. I was trying to say it contradicts Rennie's argument, but I didn't tell you Rennie's argument. So, okay. Rennie's argument was, hey, look, if were I to adopt the hypothesis that player 1 is whatever he did was potentially rational, then I would have to believe that he's playing across and then again across. So therefore, my optimal strategy as player 2 would be to go out at this stage. But the backward induction argument would say you should have gone out earlier. Okay, therefore he says this forward induction and backward induction conflict with each other. That was the argument. Okay. And by my survey, this is widely believed in sort of technical game theorists that this was well established many years ago that backward and forward induction conflict. But look what happens here when I've added in invariance. There's a unique sequential equilibrium, and now player 2 is indifferent between those two strategies that Rennie said conflicted. There is no conflict. In fact, they both become optimal, equally optimal for this player. There's no logical conflict. Now, I don't intend that you should appreciate this example right off the bat, but I'm just telling you that the sort of folk knowledge or the lore of among sort of technical game theorists that forward induction has been shown to be potentially in conflict with backward induction. It's not true in any of the examples if you invoke invariance.
But it's a different game.
Absolutely, but I suppose I take the point of...
Rennie's argument is true.
Okay, so let's address this point, because this is fundamental. I mean, should I believe that the object we treat is the game tree the way it was written down, or should I believe that there's an essential strategic situation which can be written down in many different ways? And I say, if I believe there's an essential strategic situation which has many different representations as extensive forms, okay, and many different normal forms, all of which I should reduce to the reduced normal form. If that's my point of view, then there are no conflicts. None of this is in conflict. So you don't have conflict with forward and backward induction, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So now the proof would have to be in the pudding. Okay. So I'm not really. I think I shouldn't really actually use my slides. I should just tell you what this is all about. So I should let me go back to. There's Spence, by the way, the Spencean signaling. That also you invoke forward induction. What's the matter?
Roger still's got a problem. Is it possible to 10 seconds again? What was the point of that example?
Okay, so I'm just taking Rennie's example. So he said, forward induction would say I should ascribe to the player 1, that if he came across, he must be trying to get the good outcome. And the backward induction outcome is to go down immediately. Those would give two different strategies for player 2. Therefore, there's a conflict. And I'm just saying if we invoke invariance, then the player 2 is indifferent between which of these strategies he uses. Okay, so
Invariance is always adding mixed strategy of existing, that's all.
Yeah, we just take existing strategies and keep adding some more of them. Or if we have some redundant ones, we can cut them out. Now,
They're not like, they wouldn't duplicate strategies, or is that allowed?
the same thing happens in Spence style signaling. But, a formalization of forward induction that really captures all the examples, I think, that have ever been seen in the literature can be explained in terms of this example. And I will start with the observations originally made by Cho and Krebs in proposing this example. It is that the weak type up here, by deviating from the Kish-Kish equilibrium, by deviating, what can he get? He might get 0 or 2, depending upon whether the Hells Angel fights or not. But in the equilibrium, over here, he's getting 3. So he cannot possibly gain from deviating. No matter what player 2 does, the weak type is worse off. What's the situation here with the strong type? In the equilibrium, he's getting 2. If he deviates, he might get something worse, but he might get something better. Okay? And in particular, there is an equilibrium. In all these situations, it's true. There's an equilibrium in which player 2 randomizes 50-50 between fight and retreat. And then player 2, or the strong type, is indifferent between deviating. So we have an equilibrium in which the deviation is a weak best response, but it's not part of the equilibrium. And that's what happens very frequently in these games. This is the prevailing phenomenon. That when you have a game in extensive form, off the equilibrium path, there are all these behaviors that you need to keep people on the equilibrium path. So how does, say, the player 2 here, how does he keep player 1 on the equilibrium path this way? He does it by threatening to fight. But all we need is a sufficiently high probability of fighting. And there's a whole bunch of sort of punishments that are sufficient. For the weakest punishment, in fact, then here the strong type is indifferent whether he deviates or not. And in general, in these dynamic games, that's what we're getting. We're getting that everywhere. All these deviations from along the equilibrium path, there's some, type of the player, or we can think of the player himself as being, under some scenarios, he's in or not. So we're going to call those the relevant strategies. The ones that are optimal, they're not used in the equilibrium, but they are optimal for some equilibrium with the same outcome. Okay? And then you can say, what do we mean by forward induction? It means that in the sequential equilibrium, the belief of a player at an information set that is reached by relevant strategies should put all the probability on relevant strategies. Okay? So if I'm at an information set, Duncan has reached this, what he did reached this information set. It may be a deviation from the equilibrium strategy, but it was an optimal strategy for him, then I should put all my probability on that. Now, if there's no relevant strategy that reaches this information set, then there's no constraint. Okay. So it seems to me that this should be a basic premise of decision theory, that if an information set is reached by a behavior that's optimal, even if it's not an equilibrium behavior, then that's what we ought to give probability to. You would think that common knowledge of rationality would imply that. But it turns out you need this common strong belief in rationality, this extra condition that would say that all the probability in our belief system has to be put on other people's rational behavior, if there is any that explains what's happened. So,
Definition of rational behavior?
well, here I'm just going to say that it's an optimal reply to one of the. It's an optimal reply to an equilibrium with the same outcome. Okay. Okay, and so then, now in this case, there's a theorem. This is with my co-author, Hari Govindan, so I'm talking about our work, but this is part of kind of a general program of work. The theorem is that invariance implies forward induction. This is for two-player games. I should have said for two-player games with generic payoffs. Oh, so let me explain. Why do we need generic payoffs? Because if we didn't have generic payoffs, we could have cheap talk. I don't know, I'll just skip right over this problem of cheap talk. But with cheap talk, you can have all kinds of equilibria, and we can't, there's a whole different problem. But so with generic payoffs, and I'm only going to state this for two-player games. Okay, and this theorem is very simple. It just says invariance implies forward induction. What I'd like you to appreciate is that invariance, if you know, apart from Ken's objections, is a simple decision theoretic property. It just says people are not fooled by presentation effects of the form of adding or subtracting redundant strategies. You would think that that's part of rational behavior. And for some reason, you have to put it in as an extra assumption, apparently. I would have thought that common knowledge of rationality would have said people are not fooled by presentation effects. But the problem is that somehow the normal way that's invoked, it doesn't quite, you know, it's somehow tied to the game the way it was really originally given to you, as opposed to the game in all of its possible manifestations. Okay. Now, where was I? Okay, so invariance is a purely decision theoretic property. Normally, we would think of forward induction as just a forward induction property, in the sense that, right, people are putting their beliefs only on strategies that are potentially optimal. So we have to ask, how did we get into actually 20 or 30 years of history where we said, oh, we study these problems by perturbing the game. We have to study stability. We have to study all these elaborate constructions that depend upon perturbing the game, and actually, you know, we reject these ones that are not stable, and we select these, and then we say, we now have a theorem that proves that they satisfy forward induction. Okay. Well, as I said, it's sort of at the beginning, I've always been dissatisfied with all this invoking of perturbations and epsilons and all this high-tech, these technical devices like that. It should be that we should be able to lay down principles that tell us the answers. And backward induction, and I could go to these others, you know, invariance and player splitting and decomposition and ordinality and so on. But certainly one of them ought to be invariance. And it turns out invariance already implies, here in this case for two-player games, already implies forward induction.
So how does this relate to stable equilibrium? Does it get you all the way there?
Well, no, not quite. As a matter of fact, we have it doesn't quite get you there. And let me say that the fact that stability implies forward induction, I would say that's a good property of stability. But does that mean that forward induction might imply stability or get you closely there or something like that? And I would say, well, it seems to me that in the case of forward induction, we're not talking about stability kinds of things. Forward induction is a separate property. And the fact that the stable sets of equilibria satisfy forward induction just says that it's something good about stable equilibria. It doesn't say that forward induction should be intrinsically tied to concepts of stability.
I wasn't suggesting that
well, see,
the fact that you haven't gotten to stable equilibrium was necessarily a point against your approach. I just wanted to understand the connection.
Well, you see, in Cho and Krebs, this is 1987 in their study of these kinds of topics, and in Banks and Sobel in Econometrica 87, the whole way they do it is to say, Kohlberg and Mertens have offered stability as a candidate for a solution concept that might satisfy these various axiomatic properties. Among these properties, we think this forward induction looks really interesting. And they have their examples. And they say, well, an implication of stability is the intuitive criterion of Cho and Krebs, or their equilibrium domination criterion, or in Banks and Sobel, it's what they call divinity, or D1 and D2 and universal divinity and so on. And they derive these as an implication of stability and say, stability is too awkward a concept to work with. What we should really work with are these simpler tools. Well, the forward induction, the way I described it, starts at the other end. Forward induction implies divinity, equilibrium domination, intuitive criterion, never weak best response, all these criteria that have been proposed. Most people don't know what these are, but there are about 14 such concepts that are intermediate. Forward induction implies all of these, just as stability implies them, okay? And, but the point of the difference is that forward induction comes from a decision theoretic foundation. And I would offer, just as a general argument, my view is that there are a lot of things that game theory can accomplish in the decades ahead, but I would say that a big neglected area is the foundations of just reestablishing in a multi-person context these decision theoretic foundations so that you have a good, coherent theory of what rational behavior means in a multi-person setting before you rush out and start using a lot of elaborate apparatus, and maybe without having to do all of these kind of perturbation things. I would say right off, though, that it's very clear that this kind of stability argument or essentiality argument is fundamental, that as far as we can tell, I think this is true, that a solution concept that satisfies forward induction can only be picking essential sets of equilibria. So it will always reject this kind of equilibrium, and those it accepts will have to be of this kind, where it does satisfy a stability property. Okay? So, hi.
Why are we doing all this in two persons?
Well, we had...
Say, have a person.
Okay.
Person.
Well, I'll tell you why.
And then just see what it says for two. That might be just a bad case.
Well,
The details.
Hari and I have worked on this for years. So, I mean, part of it is...
And then we start repeating this.
There's a technical difficulty.
50 years of motor. 60, 80.
The lines of proof that we have right now.
We're stumbling around on like overtime numbers too.
Yeah, I know.
Prime numbers, you know, three is always an exceptional thing when you're dealing with that.
Well, we have a theorem for n players, but it takes a stronger form of invariance.
Well, yes, you start with the idea. Morgan's story, they have matrices of a dimensional.
Yeah.
Do you have a counterexample?
And reduction, all these things are there. That equipment is there, but you're playing around with that.
Well, there's a trivial counterexample let's take beer quiche. If the first player has weak and strong types, let's treat those as two separate players.
Okay.
Equilibrium. Huh?
That should be something you sort of mop up after you've had a reasonable theory of multi.
Yeah, well, okay, so there are.
Consider what happens is how many people have the same beliefs. There's a whole algebra of beliefs, and beliefs often is a sort of a political party or a platform for many people have a certain set of beliefs, or say religions.
Well, in the sense of sort of forcing conformity of beliefs.
Touching that, they say, well, there are only two people.
Well, at this point, I you know. Okay, Lloyd. I mean, like, I agree with you that the n-person version is very desirable to establish, but at this point, I'm only presenting the only theorem for which we have a tight proof, which is for two players. So, you know, I think that the n-player case presents a whole bunch of challenges because we have various examples that seem to give us difficulty and that we worry about. So I'm just.
Does the beer quiche example fall apart when you treat those two types as being two separate individuals? Is it relying on normal form dominance?
Well, then, in fact, like there's a proper equilibrium in which.
No, that's what I'm saying. Am I right it seemed ironic to me.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. It's just there's.
Although the Kohlberg-Mertens argued that everything should depend on the normal reduction, the normal form, and then reduction, and then after elimination of redundant strategies, so that all games that lead to all expensive games that lead to that should be equivalent, and that was one of their arguments. Actually, for beer quiche, which is such a prominent example, Kohlberg-Mertens stability was needed only if you went to the agent normal reduction and treated those two guys as different. Otherwise, iterative dominance, properness, perfect equilibrium gets rid of the.
There's no.
The perverse quiche equilibrium. It's only when you treat those two guys as being.
A theory of identical twins, as opposed to the fraternal.
Exactly, I agree. So am I right that so your methodology doesn't apply for them being two different ones? Then we have to go back to the more elaborate machinery of Kohlberg-Mertens or something like that.
Well, I'm trying to argue that I hope.
But see, the stability was actually needed to handle the agent normal case, not the normal.
Well,
if you want to do it.
Hari and I are of the opinion that there will, in due time, be a proof for the general case that the standard decision theoretic properties, like invariance, and we may have to invoke some more, will in fact fully characterize the forward induction. You know, I didn't mean to sort of, I don't know, struggle with you over what is the right theorem or the scope of this. It's more like this is an example of the thing that we have a 30-year path of analysis of using perturbed games as a way of getting these properties that are seen as very desirable. And we have these elaborate technical tools to do so. And my view would be, no, forward induction, for the case I presented to you, namely two persons with generic payoffs, it is a purely decision theoretic property because it's already implied by invariance. So that's just a simple proposition about methodology. You could say that everything that we saw of high-tech tools over decades, turns out for generic payoffs, two players has told us zilch that we couldn't have gotten just by employing invariance. Yes, go ahead.
On other grounds.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced by this, but what I bring to mind is this dispute between Jean-François Mertens and Reinhard Zilt.
Oh, they have a dispute.
Oh, wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Mertens loves to smoke. Smoking surrounded by smoke. And Zilton would put his argument, and Mertens would say, poof, which you can say if you're finished. And then Zilton would explain it again. And Mertens would say, poof. And this went on for some considerable time. lot of fun. But I mean, what Zelton was trying to say, and I'm going to put it to you, is what applications would this theory have?
Oh,
You see, now you're imposing assumptions which are so strong.
no, they're very weak.
What common knowledge of strong belief is weak?
Oh, well, let's put it just in common knowledge of that you and I are going to treat the game as invariants, that neither of us are going to take any particular extensive form as being the only way to represent the game. All equivalent extensive forms will be treated equally. We want a solution that is invariant to how we represent it.
Yeah, but why do you want that? I mean, what do you want it for? You say desirable properties. Either it's going to predict some behavior, in reasonable circumstances. Or, what's the point of it?
I thought it was obvious what the point was.
If someone deviates, I mean, what Zelton was saying.
Yeah.
If someone deviates from the equilibrium that you're proposing as a solution, what's your explanation of the deviation?
Sure. Well, Selton says in Bierkey, Selton says it is completely arbitrary what belief player 2 assigns to the types of player 1. He could think of it as the weak type who deviated. Why not? Whereas we would say, in Spencean models and all these, bargaining models that assume forward induction and the industrial organization models that assume a forward induction, they're all saying that's implausible. It ought to be that the type that could have benefited by deviating is the one to whom we should ascribe probability.
Yeah, but they're wrong. They're wrong. If someone deviates, you've got various explanations of it. Basically your explanation is that they're going for another equilibrium.
No. I said that it's the deviation is itself optimal. I'm looking only at deviations that are optimal within the equilibrium.
Let me say what I want to say.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The other alternative,
Maybe related.
the alternative explanation. Let me just finish. I'm sorry. Just like pretty specific. The alternative definition is it's irrational. Okay, but the other guy is irrational, and it might be a very small probability, that he's irrational. But that's the alternative.
Why shouldn't I give priority to rationality instead of irrationality?
Because we want to apply this work to actual people. They might be very intelligent people. They might be, and they might know. There might be a lot of common knowledge.
Well, let's try this.
In the real world, that's just not how things are. If you're playing someone, it's never the case that you have this the kind of enormously strong assumption of common knowledge of strong beliefs. It just doesn't approximate anything that's real.
Okay, let me take a real application as a place of importance. Okay, so let's talk about sort of the real world. We talk. Oh. Okay. In the entry deterrence games, industrial organization theory in economics has long been paralyzed, sort of semi-paralyzed, by this prospect that an entrant whose costs are lower than the costs of the incumbent might be deterred from entry because the incumbent is sort of threatening to meet entry with competition. Whereas there's this other equilibrium, the forward induction equilibrium, where the entrant enters and the incumbent exits because he has the higher costs, assuming it's like a natural monopoly or something. Well, now, I don't think economic theory in studying entry deterrence is ever going to make an inch of forward progress if it keeps retaining the idea that this entrant with lower costs and knows he has lower costs is deterred from entry by the non-credible threat of the incumbent to fight the entrant, when he's bound to lose in the long run because he's got the higher costs. If we're going to have a theory that has some sort of usefulness, it should be that it says the entrant is not deterred. He knows he has the lower costs. He knows he can displace the incumbent. And to see how important this is, the Maskin-Terreau models violate this property. Okay? You know that? Did you know that? You know that. No, the Maskin-Terreau properties works just perfectly fine as long as you assume symmetry. With the slightest asymmetry, that it violates it, because if you have an entrant, you have the incumbent and the entrants have the same cost. As soon as you have that the entrant has lower costs, your equilibrium does not predict that the entrant will then permanently displace the incumbent with the higher cost. So this is by perturbing your model. Your model is perfectly right as long as they have identical costs. Anyway, the point is that these are major important applications, and it seems to me that until you can have a firm, logical substantiation of forward induction, you're always going to have this problem in game theory, which I should have said on the first sentence when I stood up here. The problem with game theory is you can derive too much. Almost anything can be explained as an equilibrium of a game theoretic model. Franklin Fisher said that at MIT. You remember, probably you were still a student or assistant professor there. He had this long critique of game theory. It proves too much. Almost anything can be obtained as an equilibrium. But the forward induction thing does not say that. It says a whole bunch of these noxious equilibria can be thrown out because they can't be justified by beliefs that are whose support is confined to optimal responses. Okay.